I'm pleased to welcome Tracy Bach. She is a professor at Vermont Law School and has been on the faculty here since 1996. So obviously she started when she was a teenager. She's taught a wide variety of courses including health law and the environment, appellate advocacy, legal writing, and dispute resolution. And she's most recently been teaching a course on climate change negotiations and taking a delegation of students to the COP negotiations, and she's going to be talking about that today. She received her BA in history from Yale University, and she received her law degree and master's from University of Minnesota Law School. She has been a Fulbright scholar in Senegal from 2009 to 2010, and she most recently was a visiting professor in Qatar. So she's just returned recently to us, and she's going to be speaking about the road to Paris and the COP21 negotiations and its impact on climate change. So please join me in welcoming Tracy Bach.
Thanks, everybody. So I didn't start teaching at VLS as a high school teenager. In fact, I clearly remember, I put my oldest son, who's now 24, working in consulting in London, on the bus for kindergarten that year. And my one-year-old was still nursing the year I started here. But one of the great things that has not changed over those almost 20 years are hot topics and the ability to talk with a range of interests and a range of interest level. And so I was saying to a colleague of mine just a few moments ago, one of the challenges of putting these together is hitting the sweet spot, so that there's enough information but not too much. So I'm going to ask for your help as we go along for the next 40 minutes or so to signal me somehow when I've overshot the range and you need a little more information. I'm going to be putting these on so I can read some things, so sometimes I miss those nonverbals out in the audience. So last week I was reading an article in the New York Times, actually it was 3 weeks ago. I was at the Bonn meeting of the UNFCCC. So, there's the first one. What's the UNFCCC? I'm going to keep a running list of acronyms for you, because that's one of my goals today. Hi, Steve. What's the UNFCCC? It's the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And so that's the vehicle by which we are on this road to COP21, which will be held in Paris in December this year. A COP is simply a conference of parties. It's the quasi-legislative gathering of the now 196 parties to the UNFCCC. I should also add the Kyoto Protocol. So that's a protocol to the UNFCCC. So think of it as an amendment or an add-on to the underlying framework convention. And so what you'll see all the time is a conference of parties. And then, I won't say this whole long dreadful sentence, but this is a meeting of the parties. CMP means a meeting of the parties to the Kyoto Protocol. Okay? Does that help as a starting point? Because that is one of my end teaching objectives for today, is to demystify this as much as possible. Okay, so back to where I was starting. My husband very kindly sent me this funny article from the New York Times mid-June when I was in Bonn at the intersessional meeting of the UNFCCC. And what we were doing, which I thought was great fun, right? This is lawyerly fun, was sitting for about 12 hours a day, basically 10 to 1, 1:15 to 3, 3 to 6, and then 7 to 9, in individual drafting sessions for what has become known as the Geneva text, or actually what was being modified in Bonn, okay? And the Geneva text is the thing that we're all on this, race, if you will, this roadway to Paris, to open for signatures, to create a new international climate change agreement. So, this New York Times article said, we actually started out with the usual short thing that draws you in, which is, gee, drafting is hard and editing is even harder. And so the journalist was talking with her editor about, what's key to this? What's hard about it? editing each other's work or having you edit my work. And she said fundamentally trust. The writer trusted the editor to do the right thing and vice versa, to be flexible. So the article went on to say that trust is pretty hard to develop with 196 different parties. That's 195 countries, and then one regional economic integration organization they're called, which you and I would call the EU. Okay, so that's a number to think about. 196, 195 countries, one EU. So, a guy from Forest Trend said, this is probably the most complex negotiation the world has ever had. Well, sometimes these texts get really long and really complex. That is because this is really a complex issue. And there's no easy path out. So the goal today, summed up by that map, is for me not to make it easy, but an easier path. By hopefully having you understand, one, the lead up to COP21. How did we get there? What's the structure? So that two, we can appreciate what's different about COP21 from preceding COPs. What's changed at this point? So the bigger macro changes. And then three, what I always love about these audiences here is I think all of us are trying to put together the old act locally, think globally, and vice versa. And we have an opportunity this December and the lead up to December to really figure out your individual or group toeholds in the international climate change process. So I'm hoping I can help you find that toehold. And so that's why I'm going to battle back and stop myself with all the slides I have at quarter up so that I can make sure that I answer your questions. All right? So, there we go. So, a very quick touch on the underlying science and an opportunity to come up with or demystify a few more acronyms. So, the IPCC, I suspect most, if not everyone in the audience has heard of. It's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Even though it's largely associated with the efforts of the UNFCCC and the COP, it's actually not a sub-body of it. So just for your trivial pursuit, International Climate Change Law Edition, you can put that factoid away. It was created before the UNFCCC came about in 1992, which is when it was open for signature. And then this is the date or year you want to keep in mind in terms of ratification. And then the Kyoto Protocol was later. And just very simply put, for those of you who haven't taken international law for a while, a treaty is open for signature, sometimes at a big convention like Rio in '92, sometimes more quietly. But within the treaty itself, or within the convention, and I'll use the terms interchangeably, because they really are. But within the terms themselves, there'll be some point at which that after a certain number of ratifications, that it will then enter into force. So there's always a delay between when the treaty is negotiated and open for signature and when it comes into force. So, for example, one last thing to demystify. So you're going to hear me today say Paris Agreement, and that's because you're going to hear the media. I'm trying to pick up all the ways the media portrays this. You're also going to hear the 2015 agreement, okay? And the key thing is, getting back to these dates, is the goal is in Paris. Sorry, I thought I still had the other slide up. In Paris, to open for signature this new legal agreement. We still don't know what it's going to be called, and that's why everybody's being cagey, because of course the French want to call it the Paris Protocol. It has a nice ring to it. We all remember the Kyoto Protocol, right? So you remember where it was open for signature. But this isn't intended to go into force until 2020. So those who've been negotiating these agreements for a very long time, this time built into the negotiating process, what they anticipated was the right amount of time, sufficient time, to bring it online and into force. So back to the IPCC. Fundamentally, the new agreement, like the old in theory, is supposed to be evidence-based, science-based. And what's happened over time since the creation of the IPCC back in 1988, So again, I was saying it was pre-UNFCCC. It's a marriage of UNEP and the World Meteorological Organization, WMO. And the group was created and started producing these reports, which are the physical science reports I have on the screen now. Basically, in theory, every 5 years. You can see it hasn't always worked that way in reality. They're critical to the negotiations themselves in a couple of ways. This one, I think, shows it well. So this is the most recent report. And hopefully, are you still tracking with the acronyms? Yeah. It makes it easier, actually, just because it is complex. Sometimes it's nice to say fewer words while you're pinpointing your knowledge. So AR simply means the report for that year, okay? So this is AR5. Sometimes people say the 5th assessment report. That's where you get the A and the R. And the key things up there, SYR equals synthesis report. Because honestly, they don't expect most people in the world to read all 3 working group reports individually. So they very nicely put together a synthesis report, the IPC, that we can act on. And then the other acronym, SPM, is really, and I put this up here deliberately, not to barrage you, but to help you use resources efficiently. This is what, when you go to the IPCC website, you want to read, or at least start there. Because that's called the Summary for Policymakers. And that's the most synthesized version of the AR5. Okay, so what we learned with an increasingly high confidence level is a couple of things. One, that the warming of the climate system is unequivocal. We're seeing that and tracking that. And that human influence on the system is clear. So I'm assuming that most people are not going to find that to be new information in this audience. But I think 2 slides merit looking at it, just quickly. So one is, this is the classic slide. You can see it's out of the SPM, the Summary for Policymakers. And it looks at the warming, the average annual on the top and the average decade by decade warming of both the land and the ocean. And so fundamentally, you see not, especially as we go to the far right side of the graphs, not modeled information anymore. That's the big plus of AR5, is that most of the information, certainly at the global level, is going to go up through about 2011, 12, and it's real. It's observed, is another way of saying it. And then second, this is a complicated graph, but if you would, and I'm happy to talk about it more after the talk or in questions, but just briefly, the reason I put it up here is to support the second quote, which is that we are very, very confident that almost all of this warming, this observed warming, is human-induced. It's anthropogenic. Why? So one, you can see on the radiative forcing, which is a measurement of warming, you'll see at the level of confidence, column to the far right, you have high or very high confidence about the amount that CO2, which is the top bar, and methane, and we could go down from there, but those are the top 2 we tend to focus on, have contributed to the warming, that the data suggests that, okay? And that one of the reasons, natural reasons, that some people want to point to for causing or contributing to global warming, atmospheric warming, is solar irradiance, the sun, and different strength of the sun over periods of time. And that is considered very, very, very small potatoes. So when you look at the rest of the bands, you see that it's humans, and so hopefully that impels us to act. Okay, so here's, I hope will help you, again, in the spirit of helping you get to Paris, and having a fair amount of information to be a pretty sophisticated consumer of what you're going to be reading a lot of, or I suspect to be reading a lot of, because it's going to get covered a lot. And I think the timeline helps it. So I'm going to pace myself, because I could, of course, get a little too detailed. But let me help you place some of this knowledge, the key knowledge, over time. So I already started with of the UNFCCC in 92/94. You'll see that on the top band. And before that, the creation of the IPCC, 1988. And the first report, AR1, came out in 1990. So then go forward. So you have, at the time it wasn't 196, I think it was 193 or so, by 1994 had signed on to the convention, and it included the United States. But the convention, how many of you have read the Framework Convention? And actually, 3 people cannot answer this question. And that would be BJ, who was on the COP20 delegation last year, because I know he has. So, and our 2 newest, and I interviewed everybody by Skype this year, because as Melissa said, I was working and teaching in Qatar. So is it Kelsey and Katie? Yes. It's really funny how different people look. So Kelsey and Katie are rising 2Ls who will be on our COP21 delegation next year. Okay, so has anybody jumped into the Framework Convention at all? Okay. Okay. Yeah, okay. So what you see, what kind of commitments do you see in the Framework Convention?
I read it last fall in your class.
Okay, so, oh, right, distance learning.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. I was like, okay, so, okay, and that's because, though, that most people want to think of mitigation commitments, hard, numbered mitigation commitments, reduction of CO2, and they're not there. So fundamentally, the key take-home is that the UNFCCC is this framework convention. It sets principles, and it sets general commitments. And I'm going to come back to that in terms of what it does well versus what it doesn't do well as we shift going forward. So that's why the Kyoto Protocol and the negotiation of that was so important. It was important in a couple ways. One, it nailed down some mitigation commitments. And so essentially what are called Annex 1 countries, so think of that as OECD or developed countries, okay, agreed for an overall target of about a 5% reduction off of their 1990 emission levels. Because you're always going to have a reduction, right? Whether it's your weight or your CO2 emissions or your GHG emissions. So you got to have a baseline, and then you go from there, okay? And that Kyoto Protocol was, as you can see, rejected by the US in 2001, which actually is part of the reason why it took so long to have it come into force. Because it actually says that a certain number of emissions have to be under the Kyoto Protocol, meaning countries that are emitting a certain amount was up to 55%. The protocol couldn't come into force until at least 55% of the emissions were governed by it. Russia actually finished up that job, and it came online in 2005. So the first commitment period went from 2008 to 2012. And there's been a lot of debate of whether it's good, bad, or ugly, but numbers tell us that, and I have the precise numbers if you're interested, that basically not all, but the EU overall, because it acts as a regional party, and it then, within the EU, some people hit their targets, some countries don't. But overall, the target was met. In fact, it exceeded at about 7%. Okay? Second, it created what are called flexibility mechanisms. And the irony of that is a way of getting to these reductions by developed countries, remember that the US advocated for in Kyoto. But then, obviously, I said, didn't implement them, didn't sign. So what are they? You've probably heard maybe of the clean development mechanism, which is a way that developed countries can invest in projects in developing countries, usually in renewable energy or energy efficiency projects, and then claim those CO2 or other GHG, but largely CO2 reductions as their own when doing their accounting each year. Second, I'm going to leave it at that. There are other flexibility mechanisms, market mechanisms. So if we take these two together in terms of milestones and what they produced up until this second band timeline below, I would argue to you that one of the long-lasting contributions of this very complex process is that it has brought 196 very diverse parties together, one. and two, has created a fair amount of governance structures, if you will, to trying to test out and refine. So for example, the Conference of Parties and the CNP meeting to refine not only policy decisions under these treaties, but also the nuts and bolts of how to reach, for example, a mitigation target. So carbon accounting rules, CDM rules about not double counting, for example. It goes on, and each of those has an institution that's built around it. It's staffed, so it costs money by the UNFCCC Secretariat. And fundamentally, I would argue to you, its long-lasting impact, it builds the capacity of developing countries who participate in that governance at the same time with the developed countries, and hopefully increases our capacity to reach some compromise, because it is all about compromise. So I'm not going to go into detail because it's really complicated. You just Google Bali Action Plan, and you will see, under Google Images, and you will see some very complicated graphics. Because basically, once the US did not participate in the Kyoto Protocol, we wanted a new process, right? We wanted a process that would bring in the developing countries, because that's, I'm sorry, I should have said that. So those Annex 1 countries that had commitments were the developed countries. And it's, I don't know, I guess we could call it an irony. In 2005, when the Kyoto Protocol came into force, that's the year that China exceeded the US in emissions, CO2 emissions. And of course, China is not an Annex 1 country. It is not a developed country or an OECD country. Neither is India, Brazil, South America, Indonesia, Mexico. We can go on for Mexico anyways. So you can see that one of the problems with the structure as it was evolving was that not all the emissions, and certainly the largest chunk of fast-growing emissions, were being covered by the treaty. And so right away, beginning, actually, as soon as it came online, negotiations started for the second Kyoto Protocol commitment period. Okay, fast forward. This is the part that I've been tracking on the bottom more closely. So fundamentally, Copenhagen was this, pivot moment. So Copenhagen, which is COP15, do people remember that? 2009? It was the time when the second commitment period was supposed to be ratified, basically. Not ratified, I should say, open for signature, that the parties would agree to it. And instead what happened is that a smaller group of countries that included the US and the EU and what are often called the basic or BRIC countries. So the B for Brazil, the AS for South Africa, the R in BRIC for Russia, and what am I missing? Oh, the C for China. Did I say I for India? That those groups, a smaller group that represented most of the emissions in the world, got together and created a new voluntary, what some people call pledge and review approach, which was something that had been considered years before the Kyoto Protocol came online. So this was called the Copenhagen Accord. The developing world, which is, again, a pretty good chunk of emissions these days, because they're growing faster than in the developed world, and they would not agree to it. So I didn't mention something about the process that I'm sure is going to madden most of us, but it's a certain je ne sais quoi, which is, it's consensus driven. There are some interim rules under the convention for how to operate. They're still interim, 20 years later, and they provide that there can be votes, but in very limited circumstances. So what happens is, of course, because it's a treaty, and by the nature of treaties, we're talking about political will and international relations. So what happened after Copenhagen was a total sea change in how to go about making international climate change law that would include everyone. And so what we had is, from Copenhagen, we went to Cancun and had these Cancun agreements. And what was key about that is that in a developing host country, the developing countries agreed with the developed countries, some would say somewhat reluctantly, to sign on to at least voluntary mitigation commitments. And of course, the developed countries, which most of them, except for the US, have been working under the Kyoto Protocol and created structures to decrease, to mitigate their GHGs, had done a lot of things internally as well as externally to decrease their GHG emissions. They went ahead and followed it as if it were binding, right? But everybody was making pledges at that point. So the key date to keep in mind is 2011 and what's called the Durban Platform for Enhanced Action, or what I would call the ADP. That's the acronym you're going to read in the paper because it's the ADP that negotiated in February this year in Geneva and created, you've probably heard about this Geneva text. I love how the paper portrays it. 90 pages, right? A very complicated, complex material, and there are a lot of clauses and lots of options. But it's the ADP that will continue negotiating this first week of September, as 2 weeks after we come back to school, another week in October, and then hopefully bring that text to February, which the December, which the French presidency said they prefer to have a celebration in December rather than a negotiation. Getting the shuns set up. But that's the ADP is key. And what's key about it? Well, one, some people call it that it's a bottom-up process. And so it's based on individual countries making what are called nationally determined contributions. So the acronym you'll read right now in the paper, you probably have read, are the INDCs, which are called intended nationally determined, contributions. Okay, so what are those? Those are mitigation commitments. Those are adaptation commitments. Yep, I like it. DJ was starting to run through. Yeah, that's good. I like that. Was good. And then what we're now calling means of implementation, right? The old MOI. So we have a new acronym, which really means finance, which largely means financing from developed countries based on their historical responsibility for climate change and their historical emissions to developing countries to help them adapt as well as to integrate mitigation, what are called NAMAs, but mitigation plans. So there's finance, there's capacity building, there's technology development and transfer, and the last piece is transparency. Okay, that all falls under MOI. Just, I can see I went too far on that one, so put that one aside. But the key thing is that that's what this agreement is being structured around. Those what are sometimes called pillars. And that in campaign, that the parties agree that everyone, all countries, if it's 196, the 196 in the end, will file these INDCs as early as possible before Paris. And then it's expected that during this period between 2015 to 2020, that those INDCs will be acted on internally by the countries. Okay? And that eventually some version of them will be built on and be made more robust in the 2020 agreement themselves. Okay? So fundamentally, here's what I want you to take home from that, is that one, under the Kyoto Protocol, we had what was called a bifurcated system, developed countries and developing countries, and only the developed countries had mitigation commitments. The focus was on mitigation. In contrast, what's online to be, what is being negotiated to be signed in Paris is an agreement that will not have an Annex 1 and Annex 2. It will have all countries having mitigation, adaptation, and various MOI commitments, most notably finance. And that's bending it, right? That's bending the idea that the way the convention started. And so it's really hard. That's fundamentally what is so complex about it, because we're trying to figure out how should we differentiate those commitments fairly based on ideas of equity, both historical responsibilities and current responsibilities and capacities. That's really what's going on. So I'm going to skip the other COPs and CMPs, but suffice to say, if you really want to fill in the timeline, that between now and 2020, there's a second Kyoto Protocol commitment period going on. Some people think of it as a rump one because the parties that have agreed to it thus far only cover about 14 to 15% of emissions. Okay? But it is in play. That's what was agreed at to Doha. There's also been work on RED, which is around forestry. That would be the acronym for forestry issues and land use issues. And WIM, which is really about loss and damage. And loss and damage is something to keep on your radar, because loss and damage is defined as what happens in mostly developing countries that is not, that are, what we call, they are climate change impacts on a country that cannot be adapted to. I think that's the easiest way to say it. And what's happening is right now it's under the adaptation umbrella, but it's certainly, you can imagine, a contentious issue, because that would be an area where financing would certainly want to flow. And the idea of flowing developed country financing to developing country loss and damage has at least the overtones of responsibility. And that has got developed countries worried because they don't want a number placed on that too carefully. Okay, so then we were just in Peru and now the last lap to Paris. So what's been going on? So one, I mentioned Geneva. So there was an ADP meeting in February in Geneva, produced this text. My printout says 90 pages, has about 12 different clauses, and within each clauses you're going to see something that are called brackets. Has anybody heard about these? I'm seeing some smiles. So,
to be decided later.
Exactly. Whenever the parties have a disagreement about the language, they bracket it. And this includes punctuation and spacing. But this is what's fun, is to watch how that works out and the negotiation dynamics as those brackets are put there. Because everybody in the room knows who put which brackets where. Okay. So it's a heavily bracketed document that then, jumping down to the third bullet at SB 42, which just means subsidiary bodies, and it's the 42nd meeting of the subsidiary body. So another acronym, unmasked. Okay? The ADP session there continued the negotiations, and you will hear folks call that the Bonn text, because it took place in Bonn. Just a heads up, there is no Bonn text. The newspapers are calling it a Bonn text, but the parties do not call it. This is a big, big point. You can imagine if you're a developing country, that the Geneva text is still the authoritative text. The Bonn text is showing where we're finding convergence, as we like to say, in international negotiations, and where the text is getting slimmer. Okay? But this is still the official text. I suspect that by this Bonn meeting or the one in October, there will be a real Bonn text, and that will be the one that will go to ministers, i.e. Todd Stern and John Kerry and President Obama. Todd Stern is our special envoy for climate change. He's the head of our delegation, and all their compatriots in other countries. Because in the end, when they get to Paris, those negotiators are going to have a fair amount of bandwidth. They're going to have to know where they can concede and where they can't. So the last thing I want to put up there is second to last is the INDCs. I suspect you have been hearing about those in the paper. So fundamentally, a big wave of INDCs came in by March 31st. And that's because back in Lima, the parties had agreed that those who were able to file their INDCs earlier, right, who had the capacity, would do so in the first quarter. So you saw the first one came from, okay, that one is definitely for the trivial pursuit game, Switzerland. But then you had the EU, you had the US. We actually filed ours within that first time period. And you had Russia, Canada, a couple other countries, including obviously some developing countries. Then the big news was at the end of June. China filed its INDC. And it is a marvel to read. I was just reading it the last few days. So if you get a chance, I should just tell you that's another resource. If you just Google UNFCCC, you'll get to the website. And on the landing page, you'll see on the left side, INDCs. Click on that, you'll see a portal, and that's part of the transparency effort. Everybody can go look at it. And what you'll see in China is not promising more than it can deliver. China had some 2020 pledges, and you remember the US-China announcement that occurred last November before COP20. China's reporting in its INDC that it's already well along in meeting those. And that's in terms of both mitigation, which is a carbon intensity factor. I can talk about that more later if you'd like. Also in terms of percentage of energy sources, the electricity grid that comes from renewables, and also in reforestation. And so they already know that in 2015, they're well along to meeting the 2020, and so their 2030 goals are very, well, they're much advanced. So they went, for example, from a 40 to 45% energy intensity reduction. So that's CO2 emissions per unit of GDP. They're now pledging for 2030 60 to 65%, because they're already almost up to 40. And likewise with renewables and with reforestation. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to point out, and this is probably a good place to start winding up, is I have been hoping, I don't know if I've achieved it, but to give you a fair amount of information in a short period of time with a little bit of historical context so that you can be a first-rate observer of the negotiations in Paris, or at least an informed first-rate observer. But I would be remiss if I wasn't critical about the process. And I think there are plenty of folks out there that I can draw on. And I've just chosen two sources for you. The first is on the left is a scorecard that came out of, it was published in Nature. And 2012, you know, would be the 20th anniversary of 1992, when the UNFCCC was opened for signature, along with the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Desertification Convention. They were three at the same time. So Nature, in the run-up to the Rio or summit, did this scorecard. And so, I don't know if you can see the top, the red line, red means F. And so Nature said in terms of actually stabilizing greenhouse gases, the UNFCCC had failed. And there's objective proof on that, in the sense that if you look at the rise in whether it's CO2 or methane, or you know, do the CO2 equivalents, you'll find that there's been a significant rise up through 2010, even up to 2013. Again, this was published in 2012. The IEA, the International Energy Association, just published the stats for 2014 in its summary of the performance of the UNFCCC. And while it doesn't give it an A, it points out fundamentally two things. One, that there's been a decoupling, as they like to say it, a breaking apart of economic growth and the rise in CO2 emissions, especially those associated with energy production. And that's a big event. That means that worldwide, not just in developed countries, but in developing countries that have a right to economic development, sustainable, we hope, but economic development, that appears to, at least it's the first year where the CO2 emissions haven't risen along with economic development, GDP. And so they go on to point out the rise in renewables, the rise in energy efficiency, and the impacts on that. So, but that's after this. Oh, I should say, and they even admit that, many admit that maybe this has something to do with the UNFCCC, and that at a minimum, with the rise of these INDCs, the nationally determined contributions, you have a closer nexus. Remember I just mentioned China? China's pledging what it's already put into its national development plans. And likewise, we know that the US, Obama, our INDC filed at the end of March, we're pledging things that we're already aiming to do, mostly under the Clean Air Act and under the Clean Power Plant rules, okay? So, but there's that closer connection between international law and national law, I would argue to you, that would hopefully raise that ground on stabilization. Now, where does it come from? It's because, one, where the A's are. A lot of process has been created through the convention framework. So, one, you've got a diplomatic process where you have all of these countries, 195 countries, constantly, regularly interacting on the issue. About tracking greenhouse gas emissions, one of the Article 4 requirements of the UNFCCC is simply to report. And all countries have to report. They have. And if you want to read something like very exciting, you can read these what are called national inventories or national communications that are published and required, especially in developed countries, every 5 years or so. So that's where you get A's, process and a launching pad for hopefully improving mitigation. So on the right, this is my this is my other favorite thing to refer you to. I know I've referred you to a lot. But there's an NGO called Climate Action Tracker, which is actually a partnership of several NGOs that is taking all of the INDCs and then estimating, because they're all on different base years, they can use different units for mitigation. Remember, I just mentioned China versus a straight-off reduction off of a 1990 or 95 or 2005 the US is using. And they basically crunch that into what does that mean in terms of the 2 degrees of warming that we're trying to stay within, and the carbon budget that IEA and many others have calculated in order to help us estimate how much carbon should we not be emitting each year. And so what you'll see is the other bad news is that even though of all this, hopefully, progress that I've mentioned to you, that we're not on track to stay within 2. Period. And of course, they don't stop there, I should say, period. They offer 4 prescriptions for what should be in the Climate Convention. They think that it can be achieved in part through the Climate Change Convention, and that means more investments in renewables, requirements for every 5 years, upping of those INDCs or NDCs, and a transparent review process so that we can all hold each other accountable. And when I say all, I'd like to get to just the last point and then open it up for your questions. It is 1:45. These are snapshots that I've taken from the blog that we've been keeping here at BLS for a couple years now of stories that we've covered. I'm going to skip over that, but I'm happy to tell you more about why I think that these individual photos are actually related to the international climate change process. That even though you have bilaterals between India and Brazil a couple weeks ago, and this is at the announcement with China last November, even though you have that, and you have plenty of subnational governments like states like California taking on essentially beyond Kyoto Protocol style mitigation requirements, and that you have this tremendous disruption that everyone is describing in terms of the rise of renewable energy. And then you have the Pope. Well, we'll stop there. But so, although the Vatican is, the Holy See is an observer, just FYI. So they're there, they have a presence in the negotiating room. I would argue to you that in addition to getting those A's on creating process, that in fact all of those initiatives are linked to the international process. They may go on outside or parallel to, but at a minimum the UNFCCC negotiations and COP21, 1 gives a focal point for achieving something in a period of time, 2 gives the opportunity for developed and developing countries, right? These are all developing countries here interacting with the US, that they are in part doing these bilaterals and making individual pledges to one another in the context of the overall pledges they're making to the world through COP21. So here's where I'll end, and I'll skip that. Actually, I would like to just show you this one last graphic because I think it displays well one of the big tensions that you're going to read about and hear about in NPR, I imagine, about this common but differentiated responsibility. So remember I talked about that the underlying framework convention has principles. One is about equity and polluter pays and each country taking on its common but differentiated responsibility per its respective capacity. Look at, when you think about in terms of historical responsibility for emissions, if you look at it from 1850, so what we usually called it beginning, the pre-industrial phase, up through what is the most current, 2011, you'll see the US and the EU take the lion's share, right? And notice the white part there. So I'm sorry, US is in blue, EU is in purple. Notice the white part there, the 17%. That's, quote, the rest of the world. I like that. These are the top 10 emitters, and then the rest of the world, okay? Look at it here. Look how it shifts. Start that sense of responsibility and accountability for emissions that have been clocked from 1990 to 2011. You can see how the conversation has changed, right? So you have the US just barely ahead of China, and China ahead of the EU. So I'm not going to say anything more about it, but you can imagine then when you're determining who needs to do what, who needs to mitigate more, who needs to fund more adaptation or do more technology transfer. There's always a principle on which it's based, and the idea of historical responsibility has changed dramatically since the time the Kyoto Protocol was negotiated. Finally, just about the negotiations. I'd love to tell you more about my favorite negotiating groups, i.e. ILAC, just put it on the board, and the EIG. And if you want, I'll tell you more later about why they're my favorite. DJ knows. But they're groups that are working hard to bring the parties to some type of facilitated discussion and a compromise. But this graphic shows well that when we go, our group goes to COP21 in Paris on November 30th, it kicks off. You'll see that the parties are only part of the equation. That this is a graphic that shows from COP1 at the top down to, I think this goes to, it doesn't have Peru, so COP19 in Warsaw. You can see how participation has broadened, and it includes quite a bit of NGOs, okay? And we're one of those NGOs. But those NGOs also include business. They include environmental advocacy organizations like NRDC and EDF and CAN, Climate Action Network, and many others, trade unions, women's groups. And it's, well, fundamentally, what I'd argue to you is I think that broadened participation reminds us how much more we are all trying to engage in climate change, both internationally and locally. I'm sure everybody here has brought their own stuff and they're going to recycle, and you turned off the lights before you left wherever you were. I mean, you all have done your own things. And in part, we respond usually to local and national laws that give us incentives or disincentives to act that way. At the international level, we're trying to pull those all in line, and doing so now from a bottom-up approach, where nationally countries define what those are versus the top-down of the Kyoto Protocol. These people over here, us, play an important part of that, if nothing else, to make sure that we give you information about what's going on. So these are the COP20 group. You can see BJ up there, our VLS COP20 delegation. And on the bottom was the COP19 delegation. Those are VLS students, JD, MELPs, MERLs, LLMs, who are 10 people who not only take the course that we offer here in the fall on international climate change law, but who also go to the COP and work there, experiencing it firsthand, but also do work. And part of that work includes giving you an opportunity to stay in touch via our blog. So that's my piecemeal screenshots of our blog. And I would like to stop here and leave it up here and offer to you that COP21, I think, one, because it's historic in the sense of a new agreement is bound to be agreed to. I really do believe that. It may be Monday morning, which is 2 days after it's officially ended, but it will. And that, two, this agreement will be historic because it will include all countries in the world. And will not only, three, include mitigation commitments, but a very strong focus on adaptation and adaptation commitments. That was decided through, and you're seeing that all being reported in the INDC. So parties are walking that talk. Okay? So I hope that you will figure out how to stay engaged not to feel like it's overwhelming. And I hope that you'll use our blog and our VLX activities there as one way of doing that. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer your questions. Yeah, Pat?
Always.
In the classroom and...
Yeah, always. I was thinking as you were speaking as the kind of ponderous and inevitable nature that we will come to an agreement among ourselves to save ourselves, but that there are others who are more precipitous in their engagement in these things. They call themselves the Eco Modernists, and they believe in geoengineering, and they have the means, both as they're nations that have the means, and they're also private individuals that probably have the means to step in and feel that they need to take over. And I'm wondering whether at these conferences you guys are talking about how you're going to deal with a private individual, a wealthy individual, who starts seeding clouds or starts messing with the oceans on their own initiative because they have not got the patience to wait.
So one, I wouldn't say that people in those negotiations spend time talking about that, because most people assume that within their national jurisdictions they have the legal ability to stop that. Okay, so I think that's a starting point. But second, I mean, maybe not seeding, certainly not seeding clouds. There's conversation about that, and part of the side events, so the area where a lot of the non-governmental organizations present information, you can find plenty of presentations.
It gets assigned to wingnut status.
No, but it's also businesses. I mean, so it's like a big convention. Imagine like the big law or medical convention, or, you know, think about it, right? Lots of booths. And the bingos, which are the business NGOs, are in full force. So there's that. But second, what I really want to get to is even more moderate institutions like the IEA, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, International, I always want to say EIA, have conceded. And the EU picks this up quite a bit, that carbon sequestration, CCS, is a piece of this. They expect to get those short-term gains. And I'm not saying that everybody agrees, they don't. And that is a point of conversation, but it's not within the treaty context. So fundamentally, one, people talk about it. Two, several developed countries in particular and their organizations are actually pursuing at least the CCS piece of it. Okay, sequestration,
So you
capturing.
think it needs to be assigned to national enforcement, not international enforcement?
Yep. And I'm sorry, I'm fresh from reading about this. Have you read about this huge wind farm that a real estate billionaire, I guess, is proposing for Wyoming? His ranch in Wyoming. It's going to be it would be the largest setup, and so he had big vision. The end of the story is he's still going through environmental review. So that's the U.S. Obviously, developing countries, maybe not obviously, but have more fragile environmental governance and enforcement of it. Other questions? Yeah?
So these treaties or agreements, how binding are they? We're facing a new election, and there's always a threat of reneging on international agreements, especially here in the U.S. Do we have any way to mitigate the change in administration or change in directions to keep those agreements on board?
Yeah, that's a good question. So let me answer it in a couple different ways, being the lawyer that I am. So first of all, every treaty will have essentially an out clause. Well, first of all, fundamentally, treaties are for countries.
Yep.
You know, governments execute them, but they bind countries. Second, this treaty, like many treaties, does have a withdrawal clause. So it can happen. So for example, many of you may remember that Canada faced international, that's the version of sanctions, when it withdrew from the Kyoto Protocol. And in the second Kyoto Protocol period, right, there's still Kyoto Protocol signatories and they ratified it, but Japan, New Zealand, and Russia have chosen not to enter into the second commitment period. So the sovereignty, there's always sovereignty, and that's structured, the way to preserve that is structured within the treaty. So that's one thing. But I would argue to you, so this is the other side, is that one of the things I think is so different from that Kyoto Protocol phase is that what is being pledged as a contribution. that I am sure will someday, they won't even have to change the acronym. It will become a commitment. Change a C to them in the agreement. That's what we're going forward to. Those are bottom up. And so in theory, there should be less reason for a succeeding government to withdraw because they're based on the government's internally developed capacity to meet them. Now, sure, there could be world events, and there could be another 2008, for example. But just the example I gave you with China, hopefully the one I mentioned with the US and what we've been reading about, what's going on internally, they're relatively conservative contributions meant to last a longer time and going in 5-year increments for the most part. Oh, and largely tracking the IPCC publications. That's the theory that we're moving toward in the new agreement. So I'm hoping, so the short term, the bottom line brass tacks answer is yes, a government can pull out of this, there's no question. But second, hopefully the way this one is being built will give less reasons for a new government to pull out of it or not sign it. And third, I guess this is the real elephant in the room, let me tell you, every meeting of this negotiating body, the ADP, is about how to structure it so that the US will be a part of it. How it can be a legally binding agreement that the US can sign on to. And so implicit what you're saying is, oh, Senate ratification. So if I could recommend one more reading to you, Dan Bodansky, B-O-D-A-N-S-K-Y. He's written a very good, accessible, short report and then an even shorter publication that's linked to the C2ES, the former Pew Charitable Trust on Climate Change, C2ES website. And he proposes 3 different ways he explains the 3 different ways that the U.S. Can commit to binding legal obligations. You notice I didn't say ratify a treaty. And he then argues for why Obama can do it with his executive authority.
Thank you.
And also, David Worth, who was just here last week teaching, shared an article with me that's coming out in the Harvard, I don't know if it's Environmental Law Review, but he also went down that path and more specifically argued why and how the U.S. can commit to some legally binding obligations.
Thank you.